Welcome to the Funny Business of Food Photography program, part of the Smithville, Texas Eco Photo Festival webinar series. I'm Linda Bauer, the incoming chair of the Smithville Area Chamber of Commerce. Although this is the first time the Eco and Photo Festivals are linked together, both of them have had a tradition in Smithville for about 10 years. We're experimenting with this content between Eco and Photo in the virtual format. So we truly appreciate any feedback that you have on these topics. Today's presenter is Vicki Leonardo, owner of Vinci Images. Vicki's a certified professional photographer based in Austin, Texas, and is a member of the Austin Professional Photographers Association. Vicki has served on the board of directors for the past 4 years, held the position of president for 2019, and won the Distinguished Photographer of the Year award in 2017. Vicki, thank you very much for being part of this program today. The screen share is all yours.
Thank you, Linda. I appreciate that. Okay, so I'm going to show you guys a PowerPoint slide presentation, and we'll go through a few interesting bits and pieces about food photography. Okay, so let me get this share going. And you should be seeing my screen now. And you should be seeing the big version of my slide. Is that working? I'm gonna say it's working. Okay.
Yes, that's working great. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so again, thank you for that great introduction, and thanks everybody for joining the Eco Photo Food Fest. I'm going to share with you some insights about the business of food photography, and it's a little different than maybe you might be expecting it to be. So why photograph food? We photograph food for 3 reasons. We either photograph it for creativity, we photograph it for competition purposes, or we photograph it for commercial work. So if we're doing it for creativity, it can just be lots of fun. You can experiment with lots of different things like liquid motion and different kinds of lighting in different directions and reflections, and it can be just a lot of fun to work with. You can also enjoy doing this kind of photography with your friends and family. So, you know, next time you've got the kids over and the kids need to get a little bit of attention on, you know, controlling their activities, this is a fun thing for people to share together. Okay, so although the other thing people do food photography for is for competition. Both professionals and amateurs love to compete in contests all around the world. Some of the contests have cash prizes, some have merchandise giveaways, and others have really prestigious awards that people go for. There's often different categories for pros versus amateurs versus students, but whenever you compete, it's always a great way to help you improve your work. A lot of organizations will give you critiques or make them available to you, and lots of other photographers love to help each other with improving their work. And again, it's a great way to share your interests with other people. This is just a quick view of some Google search I did to see about some top photography contests, but there's thousands of them and they're changing all the time. In Texas, we have something called the Professional Photographers Association. It's actually a nationwide organization, but there are 9 affiliates across the state. And they also have local competitions. There's also usually district competitions, and then there's a national competition. What's nice about getting involved with the Professional Photographers Association is they help you with specific elements about an image and help you learn, you know, how to improve your image based on some different criteria. So I won't go into too much more of that, but I want to go ahead and talk about the biggest area for food photography, which is commercial photography. Restaurants, manufacturers, retailers, publishers, these are just a few of the people that need food photography. And they use it for things like their websites, packaging, displays, and so forth. They need to get the word out there. And in order for people to know what their food is like before they actually arrive at the restaurant or the retailer or whatever, they need to see what you're talking about. The Japanese have been doing this for years using wax setups, wax models for food. And of course, now lots of them are made out of plastic. Another thing I want to mention is the ergonomics of food photography. We all know about ergonomics from working in an office where they're looking at your desk height and your chair height and that kind of thing. But there's a lot more to it. It's not just the chair, which chairs have been a huge business since ergonomics was really promoted. But the height of the work desk is really important as well. And of course, photographers are notorious for having all different kinds of positions and contorting themselves just to get the shot. So be careful about your body. Okay, now another key element for food photography is relationship of colors. With color, it can be very subjective, but if you notice on this slide, the yellow background makes the gray box look a little different than the purple background makes it look. But surprise, surprise, they're actually the exact same color gray. So you can see what a difference the color and the colors that surround your subject will make. So it's a good idea to get familiar with the color wheel and know what colors are complementary versus primary colors versus complementary and secondary and all of that information. So the reason that's really, really important is because if you see some food and it's not the right color, it's not going to look particularly appealing in whatever market you're trying to promote the product. There's something called the X-Rite Color Checker Passport that's available that can help you to clarify the colors and make sure that you're getting the right white balance and that kind of thing with your photography. You can also calibrate your monitor, and I encourage you to make sure you have the right equipment and have it set up properly. So what about equipment? Well, it's always good to have something that's going to have some really good depth in terms of the pixels. But it's really a matter of how you set the shot up, what the lighting is like, and that kind of thing. I tend to use either 100 or 105 millimeter prime macro lens. I try to use the highest f-stop that I can, which is the smallest hole, and I try to keep as much distance as I can so I get a long depth of field. There's a few other points here, but you don't really need a huge amount of photography equipment. But these are some of the things that might help. Certainly natural light makes food look terrific, but you don't always have that option if you need to be setting something up in a studio setting. Depends on what the client is looking for. But these are just some of the tools that I use to keep things in line. And we'll go through a little bit more of these in a minute. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about shadows. A very soft shadow under the bananas, it's almost even impossible to see, but it's a very subtle kind of thing. But the shadow is really the most important part of the photograph. Under the lemon, we have a little bit harder shadow, and under it's actually, I don't think it's a peach, I think it's a nectarine. The shadow is really sharp and hard. So depending on what you're trying to accomplish, that's going to decide your lighting for you and what kind of shadows you want. Because really photography is all about light and shadow. In this example, you can see that the left side of the subjects are really in a very deep shadow. The apple's almost dark on the left side there. But if we add just a white card to bounce some of the light back in, we can fill in some of those shadows, not completely because we still want it to look realistic. If it was completely filled in and the lighting would be completely even on both sides, it would be considered flat lighting, and it's not really particularly appealing in terms of looking like a real setting. So like I said, it's all really about mixing light and shadow together. And once you understand that you're trying to make a two-dimensional object look like a three-dimensional scene, then I think it helps to understand a little bit more about what you're trying to accomplish. So again, it's a mixture of light and shadow. But let's go more into the side of the food photography. Light direction is a really critical element. In this example, you can see that the shadows of the wave of chocolate are starting to fall off as it goes across to the right. You can see there's different little shadows in the places where the chocolates reflect on each other. You can see some transitions between the light and shadow. And you can see again the reflections coming from the bottom where some of the light is squeaking underneath. So you have to look for all of those little details. Of course, when you're doing food photography, it's not just about the food, it's also about the packaging. That can be a really critical element, especially for clients that are trying to sell a product. For example, if you're trying to sell Marie Callender pot pies, the client might want a straight on shot of the box. They might want you to be able to see the top of the box, or they might want to be able to see the top and the sides of the box. Again, it depends on what they're planning to use the photograph for. Now, packaging gets really complicated because sometimes you can have a little window that shows what the product is, and that actually helps the manufacturers to sell product better. People will buy more if they can see the product through the packaging. So a lot of times you'll see a cellophane kind of window. Well, the cellophane can create a lot of problems with photography because it's going to reflect the light. So what often happens is we'll photograph the food separately from the box, and then we'll cut and paste things together in Photoshop or another photography management program. But then we also have to remember to add a little bit of a shadow that the window would otherwise cause and what it would really look like in real life. So again, making things look realistic. In terms of, again, different kinds of packaging, bottles actually have a completely different anatomy than maybe you realize. There's actually a seam where the bottle is molded together so that it becomes one unit. It's not really blown glass like we would see, fine art glass being blown. It's actually more of a mold kind of thing. And there's specific spaces where they actually want the manufacturers to attach labels. But of course, that mold seam down the middle creates a lot of problems because that's going to show up in the photograph. So sometimes we have to take the labels off the bottles or have the client give us empty bottles or blank bottles, and then we put the labels on ourselves, but in a way that the seam doesn't show. So it can be kind of interesting. But you have to be careful with glass, and we'll talk a little bit more about that too. Glass is, of course, very reflective, even more than the cellophane on the packages. So in this case, what we see is the photographer actually caught the reflection of his lights, whether it's windows or soft boxes, I'm not sure which, but you can see that the reflection is right there in the glass. And that's not really the way you want the product, or that's not really the way most clients are going to want their product to be represented. So here's a few other examples. In this one, the angle is a little bit too high, and you can see that the jar is not really completely full. That's another thing that happens is we often have to take the packages open and fill them up a little bit more than maybe the box actually, or the manufacturer actually fills the bottle because it doesn't really look right for it to have that little bit of an empty space up at the top. Another example shows that the reflections can be both the top and the bottom. And if you look across the bottom, you can see that there's a little thick line that it's basically the thickness of the glass. And that, again, doesn't really look very good on a website. Another example is, again, I mentioned the jar not being completely full, but a lot of times when you have this muted kind of glass, again, it doesn't really look real. It looks kind of painted on. Well, this last one on the right is, I think, the best example. It does show some reflection, but not of the photographer or the softbox or the room where it's been photographed, but just a little bit to show that the glass, that it's really glass and that it's really shiny. So it's a little bit more appealing and looks more realistic. Here's some other examples. This is some wine bottles that are great for practicing, but you can see there's a lot of problems with this particular shot. Some of the product is hidden. Some of the labels are showing through from the back of the bottles. Some of the labels are hidden. There's multiple shadows and hot spots, and it just really is not a very well laid out shot. Here's a better example. We have a very nice soft reflection on this wine bottle, and we have a setup here where staggered placement makes it a little bit more interesting to look at, but also doesn't block the other bottles. And of course, the lighting is the same on each bottle, so it's very consistent, and the viewer doesn't have to try to figure out, gee, what am I looking at? Reflections coming from different places. It's going to play tricks on the mind. So you have to be really attentive, not just to the food, but to the packaging. So reflective surfaces are particularly hard. A lot of times, the best way to do this is to not direct your light directly at the product, but to direct it on the background or on a white card. So it bounces off of that onto the product without having a direct reflection. But you know, really, it's important to look around at your set and see what are you doing, how are you setting things up, how's the arrangement before you even take your first shot. And in food photography, again, it's a lot about different angles. The top-down angle is a very popular one that's come up in the last probably 10 years or so, and it's a little bit more avant-garde. But for me personally, I find it hard to really understand what I'm looking at, and I have to kind of force myself to look a little closer. It's harder to get the shadows to show up, but in the bottom right side here, we actually have a really good example, because you can see the shadows coming with the light, because the light's coming from the left side. So you can see the shadow of the creamer and the apple and different things in the scene. So it makes it a little bit more realistic looking. My favorite one, though, is, of course, from the seated position, as if you were sitting down to eat that food or to prepare that food or to dish up that food or whatever it might be. So for me, that's just a little bit more realistic. It's also a lot easier if you're trying to show things like steam, for instance, coming up from the corn and the shrimp on the bottom left. You know, steam is hard to show when you're looking at it from the top down. Your client may want to have a lot of different views, depending on what they're planning to use the photographs for. And when you're actually shooting, it's usually a good idea to get those other shots while the food is there, so that they have a choice later on, even if they haven't thought that through completely yet. My favorite thing is the close-up shots. I just love the texture that you can see in food. It's just such an interesting thing to photograph, and lighting it in different ways can really make a huge difference. And again, it's a lot of the fun side of food photography. So the next thing is really important is food styling. We showed this, showed this image earlier, showing the shadows and the reflections and so on. But how did we get that shot? Well, I'm going to show you the behind the scenes view of how that was done. I used skewers and some clamps to hold the chocolates in place, and then lots of Photoshop to clean up the messy bits where the skewers actually went in. The food stylist is really an important element in the process, because as the photographer, you need to be focused on the camera and the equipment and the lighting. Sometimes you don't have the option of having a food stylist, but if you have that option, take it. It really is helpful. They have a lot of secrets that you may not realize. For instance, if we look at this shot, notice how the spoon is really up at the top and all the vegetables and the meat are sitting up at the top. They're not all sunk down into the bottom the way it would if there was a lot of liquid there. The way they do that is they put another bowl inside the bowl that you're actually seeing, so that the things will actually float higher to the top. Just one of the secrets about food photography. Here's another different kind of example. Food styling is also an interesting, the way food styling works is another interesting element. A lot of times we'll have food substitutes. For instance, in this case, the chocolate sundae is actually made of mashed potatoes and barbecue sauce. The idea of having substitutes for food is important because, especially in days gone by where we had really hot lights because we were shooting film, it's more important to not have the food melting in front of the camera. So a lot of times we'd use something that's not actually the food we're trying to photograph, just to have it like as a stand-in. But again, you may have a food substitute, but you may have some non-food substitutes as well. Things like motor oil, paper towels, shoe polish, dish soap, interesting different kinds of things that are used to make it look like the ultimate of what you want the product to look like. So here's another behind the scenes kind of look. Here's some examples where you can see the food photographers have set things up with string and glue and wires and steamers and all different kinds of things to make things actually look the way we want them to look and the way we want to envision the food as we're going through it. Okay, so the food stylist toolbox is going to have a lot of things that maybe we didn't think about before. Things like shaving cream and super glue and paint stripper and baby powder and lots of things, like I say, that you wouldn't really think of. And of course, none of this food is ever eaten. It's really just made to be photographed. The chef will also style food very differently than a professional food stylist. You want to really think about in advance, what is the commercial client wanting to do with their images? How are they planning to use them? Food stylists will spend a lot of time pulling out what we call the hero elements, making sure they have the most perfect berries or the most perfect whatever the food is. The rejects are used for the dummy food. The best are really for the actual photograph. And the second best, maybe they use it in the backgrounds or something like that. Key things to remember when you're planning a food photography session is to get the absolute best, freshest produce that you can get and get a lot of it. You're going to need to keep it fresh wherever you are. If you're not in a place where there's actual refrigeration, you might need to bring a cooler and lots of ice to keep everything cool. But minimize the handling as much as you can and have a lot of fun with it. Like I said, food photography is actually a lot of fun. And the competition that we mentioned earlier helps you improve your photography, whether you're doing food or packaging or anything else. Make sure you keep your workspace comfortable for yourself and for everyone. Those food stylists are going to be going back and forth to that table 1,000 times, so you want to make sure it's the right height that they're going to be comfortable. Look at the color relationships in your set and really focus on the light and shadows, because that again is really what photography is all about. Again, you're going to have different kinds of challenges like packaging and the different angles that the client might be looking for, but get as much as you can in camera instead of trying to do a lot of things in Photoshop, because it's going to look more realistic if it's done in the camera. But food has to look the part, even like I say, if it's not to be eaten. But again, a food stylist can help you really get that look. And you can spend a lot of time doing it yourself, or you can get somebody to help you and participate with you. So that's what I have for you today for the fun of food photography. Linda, I think that's about all we've got to cover now. Any questions you might have?
No, that was some great information. Vicki, thank you so much for that terrific presentation. A lot of things that you don't think about, and kind of the tricks of the trade of photographing food. So thanks again for watching this Eco Photo Fest presentation. Thanks to all our sponsors and to April for her tech support on this. Please join us for a live interactive Zoom session this week at 6 p.m. on Tuesday, 10/13, and on Thursday, 10/15, October 15th, when you can ask Vicki and some of the other panelists your questions about the session you've seen. Also mark your calendars for Wednesday, October 14th at 3 o'clock for the Outdoor Tourism Roundtable. We hope to see you there. Vicki, once again, thank you very much.